It's with great pleasure that I would like to share with you some of the musings, my meditations, thoughts on a topic which is oft-cited but seldom understood in its entirety, and that is of Dharma. So without further ado, because I have a lot of things that I would like to cover, I would like to begin with the presentation itself. I believe the format is that we will have question and answer after the presentation is completed. So going to the presentation itself. Right, so the title of the talk itself is In Pursuit of Truth, Dharma, Science and Society. And the reason for that is that, as you will see along the way, the underlying mooring of this entire discussion is in the pursuit of Satya, or truth, as we call it, which is the foundational cornerstone of the Indic society, Indic civilization, and our way of thinking as such. When we define Dharma, the first thing that comes to mind is obviously that of reality. Right, so Dharma, as I will soon come to this point, it's a question of reality and its ultimacy, the idea of ultimate reality, so to say. When we try to align ourselves according to what that is, be it in terms of the theistic ideas, which you can see on the left, we have various spiritual traditions, religious traditions, which give us a certain idea of the ultimate reality, so to say. We also obviously have the scientific way to go about with it. So on the right, you can see the string theoretic illustration, where everything is in terms of strings, which I'll not go into too much depth. So there are varying ways in which one can define reality itself. And as you will see, that is very pertinent to understanding what Dharma itself is. So going by the Dharmic traditions, the Indic traditions, one very key shloka that comes to mind, a verse that comes to mind, is that of the Rig Veda, Mandala 10, hymn 129, verse 7, which is a part of the Nasadya Sutta, which is one of the most famous Dharmic shlokas, as some of you may know. I'll not read the shloka, or I could do that as well. Iyam vishrishtiriyate avbhuva yadiva dadhe yadivana yo asya dhyaksharam parme vyomantaso adagaved yadiva naved. Which means that whence all creation had its origin, the creator, whether he fashioned it or whether he did not, the creator who surveys it all from above, he knows, or maybe even he does not. And this is where the key idea, which is very paradoxical. So here, if you see the last few words, he knows, or maybe even he does not know, is something which defines the Dharmic paradoxical definition of reality itself. And that is what I think I would like to focus on. So here on the right side, you can see that I've mentioned certain things, which you can see in the Upanishads and you can see in the Vedas as well. The idea that the ultimate reality is all there is, and yet none of it. So it is immanent, it is out here, but it is transcendent. It neither exists in the form of the subjective relative reality that we see. It can't be described in terms of other things, and yet it is non-existent as well. And it's neither changing nor non-changing. So, these ideas are some things which are beyond, understanding. So if you ask someone what is neither changing nor non-changing, that is something just beyond conception, I believe, right? I mean, for most of us. But that is how we define and we go about with this whole idea of the Dharmic traditions, whereby we speak about this idea of neti, which is that it cannot be described in terms of anything, literally, which is relative or subjective. So the neti idea is that not this, right? So nothing can, this ultimate reality cannot be defined in terms of anything that there is in the worldly sense. But so if we cannot define anything about the ultimate reality, so to say, we can't do anything with it. We can't define Dharma with it. So where do we stand? We can't have a dead end as well. But thankfully, with a lot of reflection and a lot of meditation, luminaries have told us that the ultimate reality, so to say, in the Indic Dharmic thinking, has the nature of Satchitananda, which is that you have three different paradigms or elements. Sat means existence, Chit means consciousness, and Ananda means bliss. But I'll be qualifying the last bit, the bliss bit, when I'm talking about this further as we go along the way. So quickly coming at this infographic of sorts. So there are two different ideas here. One is the ancient Indic thought, and the other is a modern scientific thought. I would like to start off by saying that I'm not drawing any parallelism whatsoever. I'll be just giving a brief kind of link between the two, but not, please don't take any parallelism from this. And I'm extremely cautious about this whenever I discuss this. So on the left-hand side, you can see the Brahman, the Purusha, which is the transcendent cosmic spirit, which we talk about, in the Dharmic traditions. which has an interplay with this thing called Maya. Maya is an illusory field which pervades across the universe, and it works with the Purusha to give rise to everything that there is. So all the empirical world is in Maya, so to say, in Prakriti, in certain other schools of thought. So in Sankhya Yoga, you would have Purush Prakriti, for instance. Then you have the Maya, which is working with these three properties, as you can see in the infographic right here. Sattva, Rajas, Tamas, which is the idea that there are three ways, three modes of nature which work together to create everything that there is in the universe. And this in turn gives rise to the subtle elements, which we call Tanmatra, and that in turn gives rise to Pancha Mahabhuta, which is the gross element. So that is fire, air, water, space, and Earth, right? So on the other side, we have Newtonian mechanics, which went on for, so he was also part of Cambridge, and he gave us calculus, he gave us mechanics, Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, and gravity as well. And that went on for about 3 or 4 centuries, I believe, roughly, before the turn of the 20th century. Right at the turn of the 20th century, you had 2 revolutions. You had general relativity and quantum mechanics. And thereafter, we have now come to a stage where all of this is being brought together, or at least we're trying to bring it together in what is called as quantum gravity. So now you may ask, what is the whole deal with defining all of this, right? I mean, why are we talking about this when we're talking about Dharma and this whole idea of Dharma itself? Briefly, before going to that, I would like to highlight that there are obviously 4 fundamental forces of nature. These are some things which I've worked on the scientific side, but these are very interesting ideas because also they talk about things which we have heard slightly in Dharmic and Indic context as well. But I'd not like to go into that all that much. If you come to the bottom of the screen there, you see this infographic on the quantum vacuum. Now that is where I would like you to focus, right? So all of this entire story comes down to the fundamental layer of what nature is like, right? So we have come to this understanding over years and years of research, over decades of research, centuries of research actually, that one can define it in terms of fields of entities. So we can define light, for instance, in terms of electromagnetism and the electromagnetic field and so on, right? So if one defines all the primary phenomena as perturbations in a universal field, and this thing called the quantum vacuum, which is not really a vacuum, it has a lot of things in it, one can start from there. And why I say that is that there are some characteristic properties of this quantum vacuum. One is that it has a certain probabilistic nature. It is not really deterministic all the way. And that is this idea which quantum physics itself brings, this multiplicity of realities that we can have in nature itself. The second is that of self-interaction, the idea that you can have things which are interacting with itself. So there's a reflexivity, so we call it reflexivity. So there's a self-interacting nature, so to say. Also, there is a certain relational reality. So I mean by that is that in classical physics, in school physics, for instance, we used to think about measuring things, right? So measuring a table or measuring the weight of a certain object, and invariably, wherever you measure it, given certain margins of error, obviously, you would find that they have a definite property. There's a deterministic property to it. But with the quantum, the domain itself, there is a certain probabilistic nature, as I was mentioning. And also, more importantly, there is a certain relational way in which the reality itself evolves. Nothing is deterministic, nothing is fixed in a certain way. I mean, there is a certain subjectivity, quote unquote, obviously, that one can define with it. So I would like you to remember these 3 properties, so to say, which I have mentioned out here. Now, coming to the real, the root etymological and philosophical idea of Dharma itself, right? So it is derived from the Sanskrit root driha, which means to hold, to maintain, or keep. And for me, the idea of Dharma has relation with 2 fundamental ideas, that of Rita and Satya. So what are Rita and Satya? Rita is basically, Ritam, as we call it actually, refers to the order of nature, which is fundamental to the way the universe is. Satya refers to this absolute truth or the ultimate reality as certain traditions want to define it, or actually it's more about what we want to reach towards. There's no definite definition or any description per se, but it's this idea of this absolute truth. So looking at these concepts and formulating Dharma as simply as we can, it would go something like this, that which upholds the natural laws of the universe and order of nature is Dharma. But that is still very vague, that is still very ambiguous. What are the natural laws? What is this order of nature, right? So there is a certain bit of ambiguity out there still. So obviously, the fundamental definition of dharma itself is linked to Brahman, the ultimate reality, the spiritual reality. But given that it's not always accessible, I think one can define it in terms of the relative, the empirical as well. And that is because of this idea of ananda, which is that every manifestation, every level of this Brahman has a certain sense of fulfillment and a certain sense of completeness in itself. And therefore, we can define the dharmic idea in terms of prakriti, or the prakriti level, the empirical reality level. And going back to what I had mentioned, and after a lot of deliberation with a lot of people from across the board, I think this is the definition that I would like to put forth, and which I will be using actively for the rest of my presentation, which is that dharma is that which upholds the multiplicity of realities in existence with their inherent reflexive tendencies. So it's a very dense kind of definition in some ways. So what it means is that there are a lot of realities out there at various levels which are existing. It is that which facilitates the harmony between that. It facilitates the existence and harmony between that, as well as safekeeping the reflexive tendencies, the way in which reality loops back into itself, reality feeds into itself and evolves thereafter, right? So that is the idea that I'm going with. That is the fundamental definition. And if we regard every element in the universe to be connected in some way, so the physicalist would say that, with the Big Bang, there may be some causal or, a connection by derivation, for instance. A spiritualist would obviously go with the idea that Brahman itself is the root cause of this unity, so to say. So if we have that idea, any interaction whatsoever is a certain way of self-interaction, because if for me, everything is connected to me, everything is a part of me at a very essential fundamental level, right? So any interaction is self-interaction. So that is another level of this reflexive tendency that I was speaking about. And Dharma respects this relational reality of the universe. So I've gone with very kind of basic ideas, coming from scratch, try to define certain things here. And now coming to the more human aspect of it. So if that is the case, right? So what we have here is that we have various elements out here in nature. They each have their own tendencies, their own natures, yet they have a certain underlying unity which pervades across the board in the universal domain. So in the Dharmic traditions, we give a lot of emphasis on this idea of Swadharma, which is that you have certain innate tendencies, right? One has to first identify that, right? That is the first. So we talk about self-realization, we talk about self-reflection, self-awareness. The reason for that is that we understand where we stand firstly, like in terms of spiritual or at various other levels. We also know how to relate, right? So we know at the natural level, for instance, there are certain ways in which everything is, right? So fire burns, water flows, and so on. At the human level, it has to do with traits, inherent tendencies, even spirituality in certain traditions. I won't go too much into that, but that is an idea. And this is very important also because going into a certain tangent, you may have heard about the Varnashram, the Varna system, which we talk about. It has been oft debated. It is fairly controversial because of certain things which have been, I feel, interpolated in there. But at the same time, having said that, I think it's more to do with the spiritual tendencies and not the hierarchy based on social or birth-based, realities, so to say. But that's, again, what I have written about as well. I can give the links to those who may be interested. So that's the way I define Varna, the proximity to the realization of the ultimate reality and the innate spiritual tendencies, right? So the knowledge of these tendencies help us in evolving and help us in understanding how we can relate with each other. And this is the cornerstone of Sanatana Dharma. This is this natural quest to explore, to seek, to inquire about reality is the cornerstone of Sanatana Dharma. So briefly looking at this, so there is no blind faith, there is no dogma, there is no one path for inquiry as well. There are in fact 6 different schools of darshana, as we call it, of dharmic traditions, the primary ones. And it has always been a bedrock of dharma, this whole idea of inquiry. Giving you a few examples from history of the dharmic traditions, we have this idea of Purvapaksh. Some of you may have heard about this. It was used by luminaries from Sri Adi Shankaracharya to Sri Ramanujacharya. The idea being that you are open to understanding what the other side has to say and what disparate ideas of reality can be. And thereafter, in a very respectful manner, one has extremely rigorous ways in which one understands these ideas and debates on that. So this is something which has happened for millennia, I would say, right? So it has happened for a long, long time. And Dharma, especially in schools such as Vedanta and Mimamsa, also talks about rational inquiry and not blind faith in its fundamental tenets. And as I was mentioning, the Nasadya Sutta itself gives an idea that there is no fixed approach, there is no fixed kind of definition, there is nothing that we kind of give too much beyond a point. It is more about inquiring and going along the way with it. So one may ask, fine, that's all fine, but for a relatable, like, an understanding, what are the rules of dharma? And as paradoxical as that may seem, I would say there aren't any. And that is because at a certain level, I mean, dharma, at least at the empirical level, is contextual. Unless one has a realization in terms of the ultimate reality, we obviously live in the empirical world. So that is contextual in a certain way. There are certain key ideals and values and basis for dharma that does not specify change with time, but the specifics change with time. For instance, to give you an example, what was dharmic in the age of the Mahabharata, for instance, like the ideas of polygamy and niyog, for instance. These are ideas which go with the yuga dharma. There is a dharma for each age. There are certain ideas which are present. Was relevant for them, right? If we exactly take that from there and bring it today for today's world, we may be frowned upon, right? That's something which is not really acceptable in certain countries and various civilizations and cultures. So the idea is that these things change, but there are certain underlying ideas which don't, right? So I'm going to try to understand what is the underlying mooring, the basis for that. And I have identified 4 different things which are really fundamental to dharma in some ways. So one is obviously disposition and character, so which is sanskara, which we call in Sanskrit. There is samposhaniyata, which is basically sustainability. The idea of sustainable development and responsible existence is something which is fundamental to a dharmic tradition. Sarvavyapitva, which is universality. So there is a certain universal nature of dharma. And moksha, which is of that of liberation, the idea of liberation, which I'll be speaking about briefly as well. So coming to sanskara.
Mrittunjoy, can I
Yes.
interrupt for 1 second,
Yes,
if you don't
yeah.
mind? Can you just
Yes,
move a
please.
little slower? Because I got some
Okay, sorry,
feedback
sorry.
from
Yes,
people
sorry.
that you're moving. You can take 10, 15 minutes extra, no problem, but just move a
Okay,
little
okay,
slower.
yes. Yeah, there are lots of things. Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you for that.
I
Yeah,
got some feedback from the chat.
sure,
So
sure. Yeah,
sorry
thank
about
you.
that.
Yeah, no worries. Right. So going back to the definition of dharma itself, right? So we have the idea that which upholds all of existence and respects the multiplicity of realities and here of individuals, this naturally brings in ideas such as liberty, equality, brotherhood, charity, compassion, inclination towards nonviolence, and so on. And it's very simple. I mean, I could actually go on each of them. These ideas have been discussed with, my own Swamiji, my guru from the Ramakrishna mission. There are other well-known spiritual luminaries I've spoken to this about. And it comes from, an understanding of that fundamental definition and going from there. So, for instance, liberty obviously arises from the tendency of dharma to respect that multiplicity that we spoke about, and also respect the possibilities of life for that individual, looking at the relational reality at the social level, at the societal level, maintaining that harmony, maintaining that balance, essentially, right? And what is dharma also invariably includes spiritual, public, and political freedom, as well as what I wrote about a few months back. And again, for those who may be interested, this is dharmocracy, which is that of political, economic, and spiritual democracy. So everybody has a right to representation in some ways, and also in the economic sense and the spiritual sense as well. The whole idea of exclusivism doesn't come into the picture because our definition of going, of dharma itself has this broad framework that I was kind of mentioning about. And how do we kind of take this idea? These are abstract ideas. The definition itself was fairly abstract in some ways, to look at day-to-day activities, right? So if you were to ask me, tell me what exactly are the 5 or 6 things that I have to kind of look at, right? And to keep away from, let's say. So that has a certain resonance with what, with a set of ideals, which, you can see in everything from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra to Buddha's Eightfold Path, to the Christian thought on sin, to Jain beliefs as well. So all of them have these fundamental ideas, and all of them relate to the definition that I had put forward at the very beginning. And this is what it is. The Dharmic way is one that curtails what are known as Mahapatakas and a few others. So there are, I think, 6 of them here. The Mahapatakas are certain fundamental, things we must not do. And then there was a 6th one that was added along the way. So it's Kama, Krodh, Lobh, Moh, Mad, and Matsarya. So there's a Ra there, Matsarya, it should be. So that is lust, anger, greed, attachment, and there is Mad, and then there is jealousy, right? And so that's the idea out here. So again, I can go into the details of that, but the thing is, I'll just go into a few of them. So the last element, for instance, comes from the perversion of the relational reality that we spoke about. Anger comes from individualism taken to the level wherein anything that is not compliant with one's state of being or belief causes one a little bit of friction, so to say. Going down, jealousy comes by looking at the hierarchy based on elements, which is again a false identification if one were to look at it, because as I was saying, there are different tendencies and states of being for everybody. And that is not setting a hierarchy. There is a certain relation reality that still exists. And that is the primary point of focus. So jealousy and all of these should be avoided if one truly understands what dharma is, essentially. So in the dharmic way, the goal of life, as I would be expanding on later on, is the realization of the unity with Brahman, this cosmic principle, so to say. And this realization is impeded by these vices, these qualities that I spoke about. I will be circulating this presentation to Amitji, so if you want to have a little more thought about these, I'll be happy to even interact on those. And so therefore, breaking these habits are very important, but they're not easy. They are lifelong processes. It's a lifelong process to kind of get rid of that. And you know, when that happens, so to say, I mean, if you read things right from the Upanishads to the various works of Adi Shankara, to various other renditions of works by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as well, I mean, his sayings and all, you will see certain ideas and things that come to the fore, satisfaction with life, the true identification with the principle of Brahman, for instance, there are certain other ways in which Brahman is presented in some of these traditions. But one thing which comes above all else, and which is also mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita and some of these sayings of Krishna, is this idea of equanimity, right? That one does not get associated or attached or affected, that is an important word, affected by things which are in the relative of the empirical world. And there is a Sanskrit term, sthita pragya, which you can see on the screen. And this is the ultimate conditioning or the lack thereof, basically, because you are not conditioned in a way whereby you are affected by these conditioning, by any conditioning for that matter, right? You do participate in the world, but you don't get affected by it. There's certain equanimity in there. So again, this is something which is, one comes at it from a spiritual aspect, not from the thought or a mental or cultural aspect necessarily, but this is something which has been written about quite extensively, so I thought about mentioning this as well here. So coming to the idea of samposhniyata, which is sustainability, I think the dharmic way is a highly progressive one. And I think for me, the one big thing which comes out of the idea of dharmic existence is that of responsible and sustainable existence. And again, this ties back to what we had discussed previously. I'll be going into some of these details and looking at some of these things which match with our modern day sustainable goals, so to say, right? So coming at it from the angle of the SDGs, for instance, I mean, I didn't quite go at it from that angle, but let's go one by one. So on poverty, markets, and economic growth, right? So Dharma is all about ending poverty, and I'll be mentioning a few of these resources, which talks about this. Poverty here does not only mean the lack of financial resources, it also means poverty of the way in which one treats others. For instance, the social discrimination, the relative, the lack of moral character, for instance, or even spiritual wealth, quote unquote spiritual wealth, various other dimensions of that. So poverty exists not only in the economic, but in various other ways as well, social, spiritual, and so on. And the lack of education and healthcare is obviously tied into that as well. And you can learn about poverty and the significance of material wealth from this famous line from the Rig Veda again, which is Mandala 10, hymn 117, verse 5. I'll not be going into that, but it talks about the value of charity, basically, and the changing dynamics of wealth. The Shatpat Brahman, 11.1.6.24, you can go and, I can forward the resource as well, link social prosperity and dharma. So the idea here is that at the subsistence level, if somebody does not have the resources to live a harmonious life, to live a life whereby they can exist with, as I will be going forward, with the ideas of purusharth, which is that of basic amenities and basic elements which are very important for one's subsistence, one cannot reflect on the beyond. One cannot reflect on transcending that, as we were talking about. So the very first thing that is required is to ensure that the social prosperity and this whole idea of welfare, in some ways, although welfare not in the sense of how politicians today define it necessarily all the way, but welfare as a general principle, so to say, is very important. And so here come the purusharth. So there are 4 different purusharth: artha, kama, dharma, moksha. Artha means capital and prosperity. Dharma is dharma, as we were talking about. Kama is desire in some ways. It's also regarded as lust in certain definitions. And moksha is salvation. And each of these are intricately intertwined with each other. And because of that, the whole idea of capital and prosperity is very important, albeit in a dharmic way. Securing them and acquiring them in a dharmic way is very important. And therefore, the dharmic tradition calls for ensuring that there is a sustainable economic growth and there is decent work for all. And the reason for that is the preeminence of karma, right? We have heard about it in the Bhagavad Gita, we have heard about it in various Upanishads, the whole idea that even though we may not want to identify with the illusory world out here, which is not really the true nature of Brahman. Brahman is beyond this, as we were discussing, but yet karma has its own importance, and that is because there are some things known as sanskara, as we were talking about. There are some actions which we have to go through to kind of make our spiritual progress go the way it should. So that is the way in which Dharmic traditions kind of discuss karma yoga, and yet not being attached to the results of the labor that you do, right? So the governments should ensure that everyone should have that. The Vedas themselves, this is very interesting. If you look at all these points below, it talks about work and labor in various areas. So obviously, that is to do with, you know, in the ancient times, these were things which were very important. So agriculture, weaving, artistry, skilled labor, work of a boatman, barber, ironsmith, smelter, metallurgy, all of that. You can see it in Rig Veda, you can see it in the Yajur Veda, even in the Atharva Veda for that matter. So there is a lot of preeminence given to work and labor and karma, so to say. And coming at the last bit in this section, the whole idea of a dharmic economy, right? So I was talking about welfare, but I mean, the way it is put forward in today's time, I think sometimes, and I'm going to be very, very cautious and slightly politically correct in a certain way, has its caveats and has the ways in which it is not optimum for everyone. So the whole idea of enforced regulations, the way in which we control markets, which even Chanakya talks about in the Arthashastra, Vishnugupta Kautilya, is not always conducive to the way in which things should evolve. So there is this whole idea that, and this comes from the idea of neti as well, which is that you cannot define the proactive positive thing, but you can check the negative repercussions of something, right? You can say what it is not, but you may not be able to say what it is, right? So the whole idea, coming at it from there, tells us that the dharmic economy would be one that respects and uses the liberty of the individual and the swadharma, the natural talents, tendencies, skills, and so on, to ensure the welfare and relational reality of all. How to kind of harness that, so to say, for the relational reality and welfare of all, without compromising on the rule of law and the remedial steps that are required to keep this harmony, this balance, so to say, right? So we don't go about saying that everyone should be owning, you know, everything out there. We also don't say that there should be crony capitalism out there, but we go at it from a certain sense of balance, and this whole idea that I was trying to kind of put forward. Again, obviously, there must be economists maybe possibly out here who may disagree, but this is an idea that I spoke about and wrote on previously as well. So talking about hunger, good health and hygiene. So in the Rig Veda, Mandal 1, hymn 187, the glory of food is spoken about. The Dharmic tradition obviously promotes healthy existence, sattvic food, which is food that allows for one's mental, spiritual, physical well-being, so to say. And it's connected to this idea of sattva, which I was speaking about back in one of the early slides, is very important. The yoga system also talks about asanas, postures, and the way of breathing properly. So pranayama, as we speak about as well. In the Sushruta Sutrasthana, one sees Sushruta, this famous physiologist, if you would, and also somebody who was, had written seminal pieces on medicine, speaks about what is balanced health, so to say. So he talks about doshas, biological energies, digestive fire, balanced body, elimination of waste, for instance, the senses, the balance of senses, a balanced mind, and even a soul. So absence or reduction of any of these, and them not being in balance or in the right kind of combination, leads to what Sushruta regards as a disorder, which is obvious, which is fairly evident. But this is something which was mentioned back at that time, and this was something which has been followed for a long, long time in the Indic Dharmic tradition, so to say. And so Dharmic traditions talk about the maintenance of this health in a holistic manner. So Sushruta's definition should have given that. And medical topics have been dealt with extensively. So there's Oshadhi Sukta, which talks about the study of plants for various pharmacological uses. Jamadagni, Kanva, Angiras, Kashyapa, the various sages, rishis, who spoke about various herbs for remedial purposes. Sushruta himself spoke about surgery. And at the individual level, Dharma speaks about relying on the balance of these elements, but it also talks about community level harmony and the fact that cleanliness and hygiene is very important, right? So the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for instance, with his Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, I think was very much along the Dharmic line when he was trying to go for cleanliness and hygiene. And this is something which one sees from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, where Patanjali talks about Shaucha, which means purity, cleanliness, and so on. And in this verse that I have cited here, it talks about how there are various ways in which one can ensure that. It gives rise to contentment. Sorry, right. Sorry for that. And a certain purity of mind, focus, and a conquest of the senses. Sorry, this is yeah. Competency to attain self-realization, so to say. Also very important, education and knowledge. As you would know, the Dharmic traditions are, give a lot of importance to education and knowledge. That is very clear from the fact that we place the Brahmins, and here again, going to the spiritual idea of what Varna is, Brahmins are not necessarily, the people who are born into Brahmin families. That is the way we kind of see it. And we have seen it over the years, recent centuries. But Krishna also talks about, competency and the way in which spiritual realization or spiritual attainments define who a true Brahmin is. So, for instance, there is an article which I have mentioned where there's a famous story, I think it's in the Chandogya Upanishad, which talks about how somebody from a lower strata of society has understanding of what it truly means to be in union with Brahman and is regarded as higher than some of the, the people who are higher up, so to say, in the social strata, so to say. So that whole idea is very important, and education and knowledge is very important for the Dharmic traditions. And that is very clear from the Rig Veda itself, which talks about it in the verse that I've cited here, which talks about Saraswati, who is the embodiment of the personification of knowledge. Moho Arnam Saraswati Parchatayati Ketuna Dhiyo Vishwa Virajati, which means Saraswati, the mighty flood, she with the light illuminates, she brightens every pious thought. It's very interesting here. If you look at this verse, Saraswati is also spoken about in terms of water here. And the reason here is that Vedic language has a lot of layers in which it kind of puts in a lot of thoughts. Saraswati is also the river, and it's the goddess, and there is more to it. There is a certain metaphysical, spiritual understanding, obviously, of it as well. The same goes with other ideas, Gamana and Gau, for instance, cow and illumination. In various verses in the Vedas and Upanishads, you can read about that as well. So Saraswati, the goddess of learning, is kind of referred to here. There is a certain piety, there is a certain reverence which is presented. And according to Rig Veda, education is something that makes a man self-reliant and selfless as well. That is very important. It should not make it one self-centered and selfish in some ways. And also which effectively liberates and makes one aware of universal truths and ideas, essentially. So that is a very important bit of the Dharmic traditions. Speaking about gender equality, this is something which has been again a cornerstone of the Dharmic traditions. You can see this particular verse from the Rig Veda, Mandal 10, hymn 125. I'm not going to go into that. That's far too long to be discussed here. But having said that, I think you can also look at various other Upanishadic and Puranic texts. It talks about the feminine idea, the feminine Adi Shakti, as so to say, as a supreme principle behind all that is there in the cosmos. So which is that we talk about God in certain Abrahamic traditions. In the Dharmic traditions, we talk about the goddess, right? We talk about the feminine who is the supreme principle, so to say. So from right there, you can see the kind of preeminence given to women and the feminine, essentially. And there were famous rishis and seers in the Dharmic tradition, right from Gargi to Maitreya, who also were very good at Purva Paksha, which we discussed previously. The Vedas do not explicitly talk about homosexuality, but there are some kind of discussions of things associated. Sushruta Samhita 3.2.4.42, Kritivasa Ramayana, Narada Smriti, and so on. Broadly, Dharma respects identities and thereby also gender identities of people. I have had various debates on this, but that is my understanding of this idea. Speaking of responsible consumption, the whole idea of not identifying with the material is very important. We started off with that idea. And I think the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, in chapter 16 talks about this, where they are talking about lust, anger, and greed being the threefold gateway to Naraka, which is hell. And it's ruinous to self, to the self. And greed is something which is a major part of the problems we see in the world today, right? So there's a lot of selfishness. There's a way in which one tries to accumulate and hoard, so to say, and that is something which is spoken against by the Dharmic and Vedic traditions. As for the Dharmic tradition, if one looks at the transience of human life, one obviously needs certain things to embellish. There is a certain happiness or joy at the material level that one needs. One is not saying that you should give it all up and take sannyas, for instance. That's not for everyone. So one has to look at those aspects as well, but in a dharmic way. So it goes back to the idea of purusharth. You need to get artha, you need to get resources, but in a dharmic way, not stepping on others' toes, and maintaining the harmony in society as well. In the Bhagavad Puran, there is also this mention where there is also this verse 7.15.16, which talks about the joy within somebody, right? It talks about the fact that the happiness within is something which is much more kind of powerful in some ways than that which is brought under the influence of desire and greed, for instance, right? So that is also mentioned in the Bhagavad Puran. Briefly looking at environment and energy, the Vedas talk about the components of nature. All the elements are spoken about. There are various deities associated with the elements as well: Varuna, Indra, Marut, Mitra, Aditya, and so on. I have mentioned this line from the Shukla Yajurved, which means that all the beings in nature, all the entities, all the elements, one should look at them with the eye of a friend, and one should kind of work with them in that way. The Rig Veda also has an entire hymn on water, the significance of water, and which is Mandal 10, hymn 9. And it gives a similar preeminent position to air and the whole value of air. It obviously talks about it in terms of deities out there and Vayu and so on. And the human breath, the prana as we call it, the vital energizing breath of the humans, so to say. This is quite long, but I'll go briefly over certain things. So there are, in the small inset bullets, you can see certain textual references. So there is Vriksha Ayurveda, Matrayana Samhita, where one talks about the earth being adorable and the source of all kinds of medicinal plants, Aushadina Mulam. There are also punishments given by Vedic sages for people who cut down trees or valuable trees or don't take care of them, for instance. Yagyas, very important here. Yagyas were also conducted for purification of the environment. This is something which is very counterintuitive because you would say that it leads to pollution and so on, but there was a certain way in which it was done. And this is also a small bit of information. In the early Vedic age, there wasn't much of idol worship. There was more of yagya-based, there used to be, I saw this recent photograph or picture of these yagya places where people would have yagyas in each house. So there would be a place in each household for that, and there would be places for the householder, the wife, and various others. People could come and see the yagya as well, the neighbors and so on. So this was a very kind of organic way in which things were happening in the Vedic age, and it had a certain element of purification for the environment as well. And obviously there is also the idea that the avatars of Vishnu have various forms, and that does highlight the fact that God and the essence of Brahman exists in all of the beings, right from the fish to the Varaha to various other beings, and we have to actively respect that. We have to actively understand that. And in the Dharmic traditions, there are also debts spoken about to our surrounding environments. So there is Bhut-Rin, which is the debt to everything, the elements. The Bhuta are the elements, so the debt to the elements. Deva-Rin, Rishi-Rin, Pitra-Rin, Nari-Rin, and so on. Right? So debt to humanity, debt to ancestors, debt to sages, and so on. And these are very important kind of ideas. And so bringing this all around, so this talks about sustainable, responsible production and consumerism as well. Right? So coming to the bit on universality, and this is something which I would like to focus on as well, which is that Dharma is universal. And here, this is something which is very counterintuitive because we think about the Hindu tradition as being the Dharmic tradition. It's almost taken as a synonymous kind of, a thing. Whereas I think Dharma is beyond just the geocentric civilizational ideas, which very much are Dharmic. But I think it transcends that. So that is what I would like to identify here. And by saying that Hinduism is a Dharmic tradition, but Dharma is not just the Hindu tradition per se. I mean, there are various strands which could also be spoken about as Dharmic, right? So there is the idea of that comes back to the conception of what the ultimate reality is. And here I would like to briefly touch upon this idea that I've written in the saffron, the orange, so to say, which says that while most religions and spiritual traditions may diverge on propositional truths and doctrinal elements, what I mean by that is that it may say how you need to, pray, what are the various customs and things that one needs to do, what are the beliefs that one needs to have. But speaking about the ontological truth, the truth about things at the existence level, at the level of metaphysics and at the level of spirituality, they do converge on certain fundamental ideas. And that is what is very important out here. So whether the conception of the absolute truth relates to a personal God or an uncaring universal principle, there are resonances of this divinity and Godhead. As for the traditions and scriptures, this truth has this paradoxical nature, and this is not just seen in the Hindu tradition, the Dharmic tradition, it is seen across the board. It is knowable and yet mysterious, it is transcendent and yet immanent, it is unchanging and yet dynamic, right? This truth manifests as the impersonal and yet personal, the uncaring and yet loving. So this whole idea of saguna and nirguna, which is that with attributes, without attributes, that is something which one deals with all these scriptures and ideas, right? So here I have given 7 different primary, I won't be going into all of them. These are the various conceptions of God in the various traditions. So there's personal God, impersonal transcendent being, immanent in each person, Atman, for instance, in the Dharmic traditions. There's an ultimate goal or a blessed state, which is there in, for instance, the Buddhist conception of nirvana. The common solidarity of many spiritual beings. That is also a way in which this ultimate truth is defined, and as an eternal law or order. So you can talk about Dharma, the Buddhist Dhamma, Taoism's Tao, and so on, right? And Jewish Torah, for instance, as well. And so I will be going over the main bullet point, and these subsets you can go over later on. These are the in various traditions, the specific scriptural references where these ideas are brought forth, right? So the conception of this absolute truth in unity is seen in all these places, from Hinduism to Sikhism. The transcendence and immanence of the absolute truth is very specifically mentioned in these places, including the Chandogya Upanishad, a beautiful book which I should, a piece of work which I guess most of us should read. Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, the Avatamsaka Sutra, and so on. There is also the idea that where do we find this whole ultimate reality, the traces of this absolute truth, and what are the ways to access it? Because it is so distant and so not quite relatable. How do we access it, right? So that is again mentioned in Islam, in Buddhism, Judaism, and so on. And this absolute truth has an element of omnipresence and omniscience as well. Again, mentioned in these works out here, and specific verses from these works. Right. So going back to the point, so there are fundamental doctrinal divergences. There are ways in which, for instance, Christianity says that Jesus is the Son of God, and he is very important for the salvation of humanity. Islam talks about Prophet Muhammad and him being the last messenger. So these are things which are, if you look at it, if you think about it deeply, there are no ways to resolve this, because these are doctrinal truths which have their own, what we call in theology, salvific efficacy. What that means is that if you believe in that, that can lead you to a certain sense of realization and certain sense of godhood. And there's no way in which one can negate it per se, right? There are ways in which one can look at inconsistencies and so on. So working with that idea, and something which this famous writer John Hicks spoke about, there are various incarnations of the truth. There are different messages for different times. There are ways in which, for instance, cultural and political things also inform the way in which this truth is presented. And so that is all fair, but at the level of salvific efficacy and what we talk about in terms of ontology, there is a certain convergence that happens. All of them have a certain kind of value and certain worth in terms of salvific efficacy. So I would like to go with the statement below. So all religious conceptions about the absolute truth are not absolute in themselves, but are complementary in some ways. Again, a very controversial statement, possibly, but coming at it from the readings of various texts, in themselves as well, due to the incomprehensibility, of this in relative terms. You cannot describe these things in terms of what is right and what is wrong in an absolute manner, because Vedanta, for instance, talks about how people have different epiphanies or revelations in different times, and the way they present it is in terms of the cultural context that they live in. So, for instance, obviously in the Judaistic traditions, Moses and Abraham had a very important role, and everything was in terms of those traditions and correlations with that, so to say. Right? So that's a very self-evident truth. That's a very understandable idea, and also the limited understanding and perception of man with respect to this ultimate reality. So, given this idea, given these fundamental resonances and unities that exist, one can still go with the definition of dharma that we spoke about. And that is very important because that still remains. There is no problem and no inconsistency with all these ideas. And so again, going back to the point, no religious tradition can and should claim sole salvific efficacy. And this is the dharmic idea again. There is no one fixed path. There are various paths. There are various ways. One has to identify where one is and go accordingly in the way one finds most conducive to one's growth, essentially. And that enlightenment. So now comes the most important bit, right? And I'll be touching upon this in this slide and the next bit. Yes, I think I'll go on this bit more. This is the most important bit, the final bit. So you may ask, how does dharma differ from just another set of secular, sensible, contemporary conceptions of values and ideals, right? Well, I mean, there is a certain sense of metaphysics, obviously, there's a certain sense of, experience, and that is what is most important. I think one tends to often get confused between two levels in the dharmic context, which is that of Prakriti and Purusha. So when one gets too entangled in the Prakriti, which is the empirical reality, and explaining all in terms of that, Purusha is never self-evident or evident in, it is self-evident, but it is not always evident in the Prakriti itself, because the reason for that is that it is beyond that. It transcends that, so to say, right? The Purusha comes before, as they say, even before space and time and causality came into being. So these are specific words being used from Vedic and Upanishadic texts, right? So if that itself was not defined, right? So then how can you even describe God or Purusha in terms of its derivatives? Because these are its derivatives. These ideas of space and time are its derivatives. So one cannot define that in that way, right? So what does one do, right? Is it something we just imagine? Have we just conjured this idea up? Not really. This is something which has been experienced over the various ages, essentially. This is something which is experienced. This is a spiritual experience, so to say. And going on that is the final bit, which is that of moksha, which is that we don't identify with the empirical only. We transcend it based on the spiritual experiences, on one's own, the way one lives and what one has experienced. And it decentralizes, and this is very important. The second bit of that sentence, the decentralization of divinity in the individual. This is something which is a Vedantic idea, which is that you don't have to find God elsewhere. You don't have to go to anywhere for that matter. And again, this is maybe slightly controversial, but even if you were to get rid of various, the figures whom we kind of deify or whom we kind of look up to, this is very important. One should do that. But even without them, one can transcend that. One can look beyond, obviously given whatever one's spiritual state of being is, and still find this liberation, right? So the decentralization of divinity from within, from an individual side. And this idea goes back to the idea of Om Tat Sat, which I write at the very bottom, and I'll be coming to that, which is that the ultimate reality is in you. You don't need anything else, literally. You just need to kind of reflect and go deep and ask who you are. Who are you really, right? So this is the idea of moksha. This is the idea of the spiritual liberation one talks about. And most importantly, what it does is that it tends to break the false identification of anybody with what is empirical. So as I was saying, if that is the derivative and one gets stuck in it, one cannot go one step higher, right? One cannot, how do I explain this? Okay, so think about it in terms of a fruit and a seed, right? One cannot describe a flower always if one is just given a fruit and a seed, right? Which is coming out of the flower, right? If one knows biology very well, and if one knows, all the taxonomy and everything, then that's fine. But given the derivative, one cannot always know the precursor, the previous state. So similarly, one has to transcend this state itself to go beyond. Right? And so going at it from the very practical human level, what it means is that one gets liberation from these false identifications, these identities, these ideologies, these constructs, which are at the end of the day, they are constructs, right? This is a very profound understanding which comes only from reflection and thought, and many people have written about this as well, which is that one has to have this emancipation. We are not to be conditioned by the relative. We cannot be affected by what is relative and subjective and what is out there in the empirical reality. And that is something very easy to say, but that is very tough to kind of, make it happen, right? It's very tough to have it actually in life, because obviously if you have pain, if you have certain sufferings, you tend to kind of get drawn into that. But the final state, the Siddha Pragya state, so to say, is when one gets to that state of equanimity, when it just stops affecting you. It does not affect you that much at all. Right? So that is where the ananda bit comes in, the bliss bit comes in, and the idea that consciousness is what one has, right? Supreme consciousness. So I'd like to wrap it up. So say, I kind of tried to speak about Dharma here from first principles, looking at the ideas of ancient Indic thought and also certain eminent empirical ideas. I tried to identify some of the core ideas here, highlight the most natural state of being, which is a dharmic state, so to say. And the idea that Dharma has so much to offer to the world, and it is not just a religion, it is not just something geocentric, it is not something to be defined by relative terms as well, at the end of the day, at the final level. And that is something which makes us live a responsible life, a sustainable life. It tends to decentralize the realization of the truth. There is no exclusivism here. Everyone has equal access and right to go towards that direction. And the last line here, the triumvirate of dharmic ethos, sustainability, and universality adds to the Dharma's critical breaking of the reductionist and oft dogmatic manner of thinking, which also happens to be very exclusivist at times, which is very unscientific actually. You don't tend to accept anything which does not have a conclusive proof right now. That is not the way one should be thinking. So Dharma also breaks into that and promotes rationality, inquiry, and independence. I think that is very important. That is what Dharma brings, and that is what I stand for. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm be happy to post questions now.
Hello, Mrittunjoy ji.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you can, you can, unshare the screen so everybody
Okay,
can
yes.
see you.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we can have the audience asking you questions one by one. So audience is requested to please raise their hands. In the screen below, you'll see option called participants. So please click on that. You will then see that the hands have been raised. So you can raise your hand, and we will take questions from the audience one by one based on that. So we first have a question from Dr. Kumar here.
Yes.
Prasadji, could you please unmute Dr. Kumar?
Hello, namaste to all. This is Dr. Rajesh Kumar. I have questions, and there are a lot of questions from the.
Sure.
Dr. Kumar?
Yes.
Dr. Kumar?
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Sorry, yeah, before we continue, I just have one more tip for the audience. Please limit your question to one question per audience member, please, so that the speaker has time to answer as many questions as he can. I appreciate that. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Kumar, Dr. Kumar, please go ahead.
Sure, Amitji, thank you. So I just shared that I have questions, a full page of questions, but I will just share one question here. I will be able to share only one question because of the limit and time constraint. So the question is, the speaker shared about, Dr. Mrittunjoy, you shared about Varna by karma, right? Not by birth. But I have found in the Gita Bhashya by Adi Shankaracharya as well as the Gita Bhashya by Ramanujacharya, and they explains that Varna is by birth. So have you checked that and made a claim?
Thank you for that. So should I answer?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I think so they are not exclusive things actually. They have so the whole idea of birth, right? The whole idea of birth and death and life in the Dharmic traditions is not just like there's no breaking point, so to say. There's a certain kind of organic movement into the next life, so to say, right? And the key idea here is that of karma, is that of what one has done in the samsaric impression, so to say. And so even the birth itself, which a person takes or a spirit takes in the Dharmic traditions, is defined by one's spiritual attainment and spiritual state. So it's not really kind of exclusive, so to say. I mean, you can't. When I say that it is based on spiritual attainments, that itself feeds into the birth. So your birth itself is influenced by that. So I don't think there is a disparity or there is a kind of contradiction in there. And I think I do agree with Adi Shankara there. I mean, and that's how people do take lives. If you see, I mean, this is obviously controversial. I mean, reincarnation theory itself is, people may be out there who may disagree with it. But the way in which we tend to live in circles which have thoughts and resonances, in our circles, for instance, does give interesting impressions about what things can be, right? So again, that does go into the idea that there are some innate tendencies and thoughts and impressions, so this is spiritual impressions, which we all come with essentially. And so
so my point was Adi Shankaracharya in his commentary to certain Gita shloka explains that why varna is by birth and how it is related to punarjanma and purvajanma sanchit karma, etc. Also, not only Adi Shankaracharya, but Ramanujacharya, if we see his Gita Bhashya, if we see Gita Bhashya by Nimbarkacharya, Madhvacharya, I mean, all authentic acharyas consider it is
but if you also look at what Krishna and various others, and I'll be happy to share with you these stories which come from the Upanishads as well, which do talk about this instance where in the birth-based system, one wouldn't have somebody, for instance, being regarded as reaching Brahman realization. And even the idea of Brahman, right? The Brahman does have a very close connection with Brahman realization as well. I mean, there is a specific verse. I'll try to find that for you. I can give it to Amitji later on. Maybe you can take it from him.
Right.
Which talks about the Brahman realization being something very important for the Brahmins essentially. Although the root of that Sanskrit-wise is slightly different, but yeah, there is a certain connection there.
So it has also roots in Patanjali Yoga Sutra, as explained by certain acharyas, that Purva Janma Karma decides what Jati,
and that's what I mentioned.
Ayu and Bhoga one Jiva will get. So Varna for Manushya is different and Varna for Devas and gods are different. What you shared, according to acharyas, I'm just noting here that what you shared is Varna by Karma. It is for Devi Devata, our Hindu gods. It is explained in like that in literature. And for humans, all these acharyas say that clearly and many times that it is as per birth.
I'll just ask you one question here. And we can maybe move on from there. Which is that birth and karma, right? They're not that exclusive. I'll just put it as that.
Yeah, so that is your point of view, right?
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Kumar. If you don't mind, we can we'll have means to communicate with Dr. Majumdar.
Yeah, we'll definitely. I'd love to.
And we would appreciate that we can move on to the next question. Next participant, please. So the next hand I see raised here is Mr. Sanjay Verma. So could you please ask your questions, Mr. Verma?
Yeah. Namaste, Mrittunjoy ji. So my question is, am I audible or?
Yes.
Okay, my question is, if is it possible to attain moksha through other faiths also?
Right, that's a very good question, right? So I happen to be a Vedantin, so I believe in Vijnana Vedanta. So coming at the very core of what my way of approaching the ultimate reality is. My Ishtaguru happens to be Ramakrishna Paramhans. Some of you may know about him. He was Swami Vivekananda's guru as well. So he talks about various kind of traditions across the board. He talks about Islam and Christianity as well. And he talks about how, actually, so Ramakrishna was a practicing Christian and a Muslim, I believe, at one point. He just wanted to see what these traditions bring as well. So he talks about these figures, these luminaries, so to say. He talks about Jesus, for instance. He talks about Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad as well. And there is a certain, as I was going back to the point, there's this idea of salvific efficacy, the idea that there is a salvational kind of, salvation is not the right word, salvific efficacy, which one has through various traditions. At the end of the day, it is about realizing that state. So that state can be realized using Saguna Brahman, so to say, the relational, the attribute-oriented kind of godhood. And also it can be done by personal godhood. So personal gods, for instance, in terms of Jesus being out there and, relating to him, for instance. So I would like to not give a very decisive answer, but for me, yes, you can have, certain kind of spiritual attainments and spiritual experiences and a trajectory through various disparate ways and means, yes.
Yeah, but that is not the same as moksha, right? Because Christianity and Islam itself refrain, or rather, exclude human beings to from attaining,
Sorry.
like in Hindu Dharma,
Yes.
a seeker
Yeah.
can, become attain divinity, but that's not the same case in Islam and Christianity.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. So, I mean, that is one thing which I have dealt with a lot. I mean, in terms of debates, theological debates in Cambridge and elsewhere as well, because we come at it from this perspective. Let's say I come at it from this perspective, the other side may not, right? There are various things that various Swamis have spoken over time. Swami Sarvapriyananda, who is one of the, who's a very well-known speaker as well. He speaks about how one does not necessarily need to always engage on that level, on that realm, essentially. If one shows the salvific efficacy of what one provides or what one offers, that self-evident truth itself will speak for what it stands for, right? So I think we don't need to necessarily engage that much. Yes, it is creating this friction, so to say. We may be pluralist, we may be incomplete of sorts, so to say, to put it very bluntly. But I don't see a way whereby one can politely and respectfully bring that point to them in a way which does not hit away at deep-seated beliefs and ideas. So that is a key point here, and I think that can only happen spiritually. So that's what luminaries speak of as well. Right? So
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay ji. So we have a question here from Sid. Mr. Sid, he was unable to raise his hand. Could you please unmute him? Thank you.
Thank you,
Sid, please
Amitji.
go ahead. Oh.
Thank you, Amitji. I really love your presentation, and especially the academic format of the presentation, because it's really good. You have references and links and everything mentioned. So it's really nice. I really love your conclusions as well. If you don't mind, sorry, loading up your presentation again for the last slide that you have and the last conclusion point.
Sure.
Yeah. So what is your opinion on the fact that it feels like, to some extent, the concepts that you mentioned are in a sense idealistic, like as in, like, if everyone follows it, everything will be good kind of idea, but it might not be as practical in implementation, just out of the point that people naturally tend to be reductionists, naturally tend to be dogmatic, and that the splits and divisions happen regardless of how hard you try to make them not happen. So what is your opinion on that, and how do you think someone, maybe a younger person, if you want to, because I'm fairly young, to approach the world in a way, and how you can look at this as a tool to help people realize, if that's what it is, or at least make sense of the world?
Yeah, so that's a brilliant question. I think that goes to the root of the Vedantic idea, which is that, and Dharmic idea in general, which is that Purusha, the Brahman that we were talking about, if you read, there is this famous verse in the Rig Veda, Purusha Sukta, which talks about how the unity in nature was sacrificed to make all that there is. There was a certain diversification, there was a certain way in which everything split into this multiplicity of elements and entities, right? So that is something which is talked about in Maya, in terms of Prakriti. And that is a natural thing to happen, right? It has been, according to Dharmic tradition, this has been there from the start of time. Actually, there is no start of time. It's beginningless in the Dharmic traditions, and it will remain, right? So now coming to the question about how one practically looks at it, right? So it goes back to the point which was made by the gentleman before, that sometimes you are looking at practical realities where the other side does not necessarily go with this idea of unity. It does not go with these very beautiful ideas, so to say. For that, I think what is important is qualified diversification, as I call it, which is, I use the word Vishishta Vividikaran. Vividikaran in Sanskrit is diversification. Vishishta means qualified, essentially, Vishishta Vividikaran, which is that you do relate to them at a practical level in a certain way, but never kind of give up or lessen the identification with what the ultimate reality is either, right? So there is a certain kind of structuring, so to say, in your own thought, whereby you relate at a very practical level. You do engage at the level in which, for instance, Krishna related in the Mahabharata, right? So if he had not looked at ways in which Dharma could be established in slightly adharmic ways, for instance, I mean, they wouldn't have won the war, right? So whether that adharma was required and was good enough and had a justification is something which we all deal with, right? When we read the Mahabharata, all the big generals of the Kauravas were killed in an adharmic way, so to say, right? So I think that is very important, where one needs to understand the bigger picture and one needs to look at the relative reality as well. And in our own minds, in our own self, one has to actively strive towards not getting stuck or towards not identifying beyond the point or getting attached to these lower levels. And I know that you would say that it's tough. It is tough, which is why I think spiritual attainments or spiritual life is not an easy thing. They call about, they don't speak about tapasya, they talk about sadhana. This is exactly it, right? We live in a world which is conditioned and we have to go beyond that. So I hope that kind of answers it.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge the whole way. Yeah, you're right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sid. Okay, so the next audience member who wants to ask questions is Mr. Jay Shah. Could you please unmute him?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. It was a nice presentation, Dr. Mrittunjoy. I have one question, which is to all the slides that I have gone. The first point that I would like to put is, you said that on Dharma, on your slide, there are no rules as such, right? Second, you said you have put on your slide that Dharma in itself is exclusive and inclusive to each one, which one of your slides says. And third is Dharma is universal. So look at the theological aspect of it. All three lines negate itself, because all three lines negate itself. Also, when we see Dharma is actually a set of rules, or I would say do's and don'ts to follow and don't follow. If you do something which is not allowed, it is called a dharmic practice. So can you explain how these three come together?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I think, if one wants to think about it in terms of the logical, rational way, I think that is something which one should not from the get-go. And the reason for that was there in my very first slide, which is that Brahman itself, the ultimate reality, is paradoxical. And what I mean by that is there are certain ways in which things transcend, and there are certain ways in which things are immanent. In this particular context, because you raised certain points, let me try to, so you mentioned about the universality, and you mentioned about, sorry, can you repeat the first two ones, please?
Yeah, the first you said Dharma itself, it does not have any rules. The second one was Dharma is inclusive and exclusive to one itself. How people can approach it. And the third one is the universality.
Yeah, so I think one has to identify that Dharma itself lies at various levels. So I was talking about the Yoga Dharma, for instance. I mentioned that example of Niyoga, for instance. So Niyoga at that time, as I was saying, was not something foundable. It was something very usual. So Vichitra Virya, the king in the Mahabharata, was killed, died because of natural ailments, and then his wife had Niyog with Vedavyas, and that's how Dhritarashtra and Pandu came to be, right? So that was something acceptable. But today, in today's age, right, these social set ethos, customs, and beliefs, right, they have had a certain evolution, right? Even in India, where Niyog was where it was. And so that is what, when one talks about Yoga Dharma, obviously there's a spiritual aspect to it. When one talks about Satyog and so on, one talks about the spiritual attainments and so on. But at a social level, there are some ideas which hold sway, right? Then one comes to the Swadharma. So there is a level which comes at the personal level, right? So that is something which is very tough to kind of trail, because if you think about it, I'll give you some examples, right? So Bhishma, for instance, Bhishma was somebody who kept to his dharma in some ways. He stuck to what he was wanting to do and his oath, so to say, and yet he was a dharmic in some ways. Similar for Karna, he was very clear about his friendship and his commitment, yet he was a dharmic in some ways, right? So I mean, again, going back to the point, this is not something which is written in stone, right? And the reason, and that is what is so important, which is that these values.
So I have one question
understanding
on
the
that
spirit,
when you said,
yeah.
if it is not written in stones, will it not throw the whole world into chaos? Because if you look at
No.
2500 years back,
Yeah.
there was no another, let's say 5000 years back, there was no other religion than Hinduism, Sanatan Hindu Dharma.
Yeah.
So all the ideas that have been there, are they not, because Sanatan itself says it is eternal, this is what it is. So when you say that it is uh, exclusive to person and person only, it itself
Not
negates the
really.
idea of Sanatan, and when you say it is up to one's own perception.
Right. So thanks for that. So I think there are two things here, which is that I think I mentioned there are some underlying resonances, ideals, and values which don't come from the social context, but which comes from a layer below. That is why it is Sanatan, because there is something which as I was mentioning earlier, there is this definition that I put forward and tried to derive everything in terms of that. It is coming from a much more profound and fundamental level, right? I am saying that the social interpolations or social evolution or derivations can evolve with time, right? So at that level, there is nothing set in stone, right? But it should not compromise on the underlying fundamental moorings of what Sanatan Dharma is. And that is what I think I mentioned in the Sarva-Vyapitva thing as well, also in the Sanskara bit. Those are things which come from that level, so they cannot be compromised. But at the same time, there are some aspects of it which obviously over time, given social realities and other things, may evolve, so to say. So that is what I was mentioning. If I can
Yeah, doctor, thank you for the answer. Because of time constraint, we cannot discuss more. But
sure, I love to talk to you.
I actually disagree, and we can definitely go on further discussions.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, but thank you for the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. So, Dr. Majumdar, there is another question from, actually it has come up in the chat, group chat. The person cannot ask the question, he's not able to. So the question that has been asked is, the concept of poverty is related to the worship of Lakshmi. So how do you explain that? And also in today's terms, do dharmic principles closely relate to socialism?
Okay, right, very interesting. So coming to the first point about Lakshmi, so she's obviously the personification, the embodiment, so to say, in the Dharmic traditions of certain ideas of wealth and prosperity, and that is a way of kind of engaging with it, and we have done that. So I'm not very sure what the question exactly is, because
unfortunately, yeah, the person, actually it is the Indic studies, the host himself, who wants to ask the question, but he cannot.
I'll go for the second one then.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, right. So I was at, I have been closely associated with Cambridge and various other universities, and obviously there's a whole socialist kind of fervor to things in the political circle. So I was a student leader myself. So as somebody who believes in dharmic ideas and principles, one has had interactions with them. There were very fundamental differences. But I think what one needs to understand here is that there are resonances as well. Now, before everyone jumps on me, I'll mention how it is not exactly dharmic either, right? So obviously, when one talks about social welfare, right, the idea that everyone has a certain, dignity, a certain way in which one should be assured a good life, essentially, that is something which Dharma obviously stands up for. But the means to get there, right, that is what is most important. Is it that if we make everyone co-owners of things which are out there, resources and amenities, will that really get us through, and will that get us there, essentially? I don't think so, right? That is where I think fundamentally I disagree with them, and that is what I mentioned in the idea of dharmic economy as well. There has to be a certain element of balance. There has to be a certain correctional free market, so to say. I mean, there is supposed to be something whereby if there are people who are really at the lower end of the economics ladder, one has to look into how to facilitate that. But meritocracy, swadharma, again going back to that idea, the idea of innate tendencies, that cannot be compromised on, because everyone has to have a certain natural evolution as well. So if one says one can facilitate education, healthcare, basic education and healthcare, looking at making them capable enough to be self-reliant and move forward, maybe we can talk till there, right? But when one says everything needs to be nationalized or everything needs to be a certain way, I have my differences there with that, right? So that's my personal opinion, essentially. I'll be happy to kind of discuss as well.
Thank you, Dr. Majumdar. Okay, so the next audience member who wants to ask a question is Mr. Manish Agarwal. Could you please unmute Mr. Manish Agarwal? Go ahead.
Yeah, namaskar, Dr. Mrittunjoy. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Mrittunjoy, actually, I'm extremely interested in cosmology and physics. At the same time,
Yeah.
I'm interested in our Vedic roots as well. So my question is actually two parts of the question, but the same thing.
Yeah.
First of all, we know, at least as far as I know, we are going through the normal physics and cosmology is going through a crisis at this point in time. So they're trying to explain so many things, dark energy, dark matter, and blah, blah, blah. And I know Vedic has sorts of answers for that, because Vedic believes in concept of kind of emergent properties as opposed to them being sort of very atomic in nature. My question is that, but from our point of view, from Vedic point of view, we always try to fit in ourselves into what discovery West has made, or the new cosmology of physics has made. So this sort of creates pitfalls. So let's say Higgs boson comes through, we try to explain it through some Vedic mechanism, which may or may not be true. Like Vedic mechanism itself can be true, but the Higgs boson could be just one of the things. And West keep on creating the new field. I'm reasonably sure in the next 10 years, they will find some 10 new different properties, and they'll create 10 new fields in the field, quantum field theory and all of that. So how do you see, like, what are the pitfalls and how we can get ahead of the curve in actually getting these ideas beyond Western philosophy, so that, simplification of the physics and cosmology can happen, and then our ideas are the ones which actually starts getting observed through the instrumentation and all of those things. Because
right. That's a brilliant question. I think there is, so that is something which comes up often in certain circles. And that's obvious because I have these two things that you mentioned, science and spirituality in my life. I would start off by giving a word of caution, though, right? I mean, here in India and elsewhere as well, we often tend to extrapolate certain poetic ideas and references to being scientific truths, and that is not correct, right? From the get-go, I would like to clear that out of the way. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in blindly believing in things as well. That's not the Dharmic way in itself. So that's not what I would like to look into at all, right? But having said that, there are some ideas which even people like Werner Heisenberg and various others in the 20th century mentioned about from the Vedas, where they speak about subjectivity and they talk about the reality not quite being deterministic, for instance, and certain ideas in quantum physics. That's what people say. I'm not sure how much that informed their work. But having said that, I think there are some resonances. There are resonances, for instance, in terms of Rajasic and Tamasic ideas, element. Tesla and Vivekananda were very interested in this at one point, this whole Akashic field. What are the gunas in terms of physics, for instance, and so on. I personally, I mean, I have thought about this at one point and kind of sometimes still do. I think the problem comes because of a certain divide between the Purusha element and the Prakriti element. Why I say that is that the Prakriti is what is space-time, what is causality oriented. Purusha is what is transcendent, right? So physics and science in general depends upon what is relative, what is empirically, you can find and characterize and describe, right? So if one has to rely on something transcendent, there is no way to do it. So for instance, even when one talks about hidden dimensions, or higher dimensions, sorry, then one only looks at how a particle goes into a certain reaction and there's nothing that comes out. There's a certain discrepancy, so to say, right? And there are people who conjecture that could be because of the fact that it went into that dimension, right? So one can only have conjectural or certain kind of, certain such ideas. One cannot pin it down with the facilities of what, I go back to the point, is a derivative of the Purusha element in the Dharmic side, right? So there is a certain divide there. But there are elements, there are things like, for instance, what are Tanmatras? Possibly you could find something which has a resonance directly with physics. I will still have a word of caution there, and I'd like to take the two separately. These are two strands of my life which I take kind of, but there are resonances, and I do discuss this with various people at various points. But my scientific work is not necessarily always oriented around this, and neither vice.
Yeah,
So,
just one quick
both are
point
important. Both have resonances.
Yeah, one quick point I want to add. So basically, what I personally feel is we define Sukshma much better than Sthula.
Yes.
They define everything is in terms of Sthula, and they get a glimpse of Sukshma, but they don't care less. What I'm saying is, can Sukshma go ahead of Sthula and then start defining? Sukshma is the main thing, and Sthula is emergent of that.
Yeah. So you're saying if Sukshma can go ahead of the Sthula? I mean,
maybe the knowledge of Sukshma defines the knowledge of Sthula.
Right. So there is this, So there is this academic, Professor Hegel, I'm not sure if you've heard of him. He's in the Maharshi University, I think. So he gave a very interesting proposal, which is that if fermions and the fields themselves can be the Sukshma, and the excitations, the electrons, the fields can be the Sukshma, and the excitations can be the Sthula, that could be a way one can go at it, right? So again, I mean, one has to take that with a pinch of salt. There are ways and resonances, but it's open out there.
Thank you, Doctor. I really appreciate your answer.
Thank you, Mr. Agarwal. So, Dr. Majumdar, I don't see any raised hands, so I may be permitted to ask a question myself.
Sure.
You can answer this, and we'll make that as the last question. So the question I had was, again, a thought which came to my mind. For example, say in today's age, say for example, India's prosperity as such, like we talk in respect to say India specific, and India says that, or the economist says that, or everybody says that, to grow, you need to, like grow your resources or use your resources so that you produce more and you grow more. So for example, if everybody starts looking for things like material things, for example, which will ultimately, convert to demand, the demand portion of economy, you can say. And if you demand more because you want to consume more, and then how will that relate to the concept of sustainable living? Say, for example, everybody wants things which are, say, for example, like a smartphone today, for example, is considered a very necessary thing. And we, like at 101.3 billion population, and it's a good thing. Not everybody use it though, of course. But then if we start producing for, not just in India, but maybe from all over the world, the resources that are required for the population to meet their basic needs, which I think expand as day goes by or days go by, then how do you balance that with sustainable living or sustainable economy?
Very important question. So I think, so as somebody who has worked in environmental activism earlier in my student days, something that comes up is e-waste, for instance, right? So when one uses a lot of, CDs and various other gadgets, and, there's not much of a proper disposal system, so to say. And you can see the land dumps, you can see various waterways being affected and so on, right? And it's not that it's going down. It will always go up, because every year, every company in the gadget sector, in the hardware sector, is coming up with new gadgets and so on, right? I think there is no easy answer to that. I think there is a way in which one can decentralize the responsibility, right? One has to make everybody aware of the repercussions of each of their actions that they kind of, not each exactly, but some of the major actions that can have a long-lasting effect on them. And that is where education, awareness building comes into the picture. For instance, I'll give you an example. Here in India and various other places in the tropical belt, you have the need for air conditioning, right? Obviously because of the heat and the environment around. And the CFC, the way in which it affects the environment, is obviously something which most of us probably have read about and heard about. If you go to I had this exercise actually recently, and I was kind of talking to somebody. They didn't have a clue about some of these aspects, right? And when they were told that there is a certain kind of way in which it is affecting the ozone layer and so on, and in a very informative way, in an interesting way, they kind of had a moment of reflection. They had a moment where they felt, okay, maybe this is not the most best thing to do, essentially, or even though it's required, but one can control that habit as well. So going back to the point, I think education, in awareness building, engaging with them at every level to try to make these points clear, I think is the most best way possible.
Okay, Great, thank you. Okay, so the, audience, thank you very much for attending the seminar. We thank you, Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar, as well, to take the time to be our speaker.